Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction. Hi everyone, welcome to the Passages Pulse. At the time of this recording, it is 11 a.m. on Wednesday, October 8th, 2025. We're 2 years after the October 7th massacre in 2023. I'm joined today by my co-host Josiah. Josiah, thank you for being with us. Today we're going to be remembering, reflecting, and correcting some misconceptions about October 7th. Let's just remember the facts. On October 3, thousands of Hamas terrorists invaded Israel. They killed almost 1,200 Israelis and took about 250 hostages back to the Gaza Strip. Since October 7th, there has been a nasty fight on how to remember what happened. There seems to be two parallel realities being created, or narratives around the world. Some say that it was an act of Palestinian self-determination. Others would say that it was terrorism and a crime against humanity. So which one is right? Well, today, we're going to remind each other what actually happened on October 7th and offer a few personal reflections about the day. Thank you for joining us today and thanking us for remembering. Josiah, I want to start with you. What do you think is important, how we remember October 7th?
I think it's important for two reasons. Of course, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts as well, Sebastian. But in my mind, it comes down to the importance of understanding what is happening in Israel post October 7 and what is happening in the West. I think for us and for most of our listeners, we care about both Israel and the West more generally, or the United States, especially where we live. And if we want to understand what's happening in both of those places, what people in both of those places are experiencing, or the challenges that we face, then you have to understand what happened on October 7 actually and what sort of impact has it had. In Israel, I think it's important to think about the fact that if you ask almost any Israeli, they'll tell you that today is October 7. And of course, they don't mean that literally, but what they mean is that October 7 is not something that lives in the past. It's an ongoing experience that Israel continues to live through. And for a variety of reasons, both related to the ongoing war in the Gaza Strip, or especially, and I think more importantly, the ongoing hostage situation. Many Israelis are still waiting for a phone call telling them whether their loved one is coming home or whether their loved one is lost. And that's a very difficult reality for them to be living through 2 years after the attack on October 7, 2023. So it contributes to the sense of ongoing trauma, is the best word to describe what many Israelis continue to live through. I think it's also important, if you want to understand the sort of challenges that Israel's facing, the impact that October 7 has had, to just grapple with the fact that in Israel, the two-state solution is essentially dead. And of course, over the past few weeks, we've been having these conversations about recognition of a state of Palestine and this potential plan for an end to the war and peace in Gaza, peace between Israelis and Palestinians. But at the end of the day, what happened on October 7 was so severe that it left many Israelis unable to even imagine what a two-state solution could look like in the future, unable to summon the mental and emotional fortitude necessary to engage in dialogue about peace with their neighbors because of the betrayal that they experienced on October 7. And if you don't understand what happened on October 7, you really can't understand that mindset that Israelis bring to the table right now and the challenges that they're dealing with. If we look closer to home and try to understand what's happening in the West right now, again, I think you have to understand October 7 in order to understand what's happening in the West, why people are reacting the way that they are, and why it's so serious that people are reacting the way that they are, why it's so evil in some cases, in my opinion. A few examples, Sebastian, and I'm sure you can share even more, but if we think about the rise in hate and anti-Semitism, it's pretty shocking that October 7, the reactions to it were initially on the day of, some support for Israel, of course, but even on the day of, you started to see some cracks in the armor and people questioning maybe Israel deserved this or maybe Israel had it coming. And in the week after October 7, you really started to see this organized campaign, this PR propaganda campaign, really to flip the script and basically argue that Israel was not the victims, but they were the aggressor. They were committing a genocide before they'd even entertained the idea of invading Gaza. They were still trying to secure their own territory in southern Israel. So you have to understand, again, that the reactions to October 7 are so severe, are so serious or evil, because they were not the aggressors. They were, in fact, the victims. But if you don't know what happened on October 7, then you won't be able to wrestle with that reality or that contradiction. I think it's very important that we are aware of the long-term residual effects, violent residual effects of October 7. The fact that the violence was not contained to October 7, but has actually spread abroad. There's been cases of violence in the United States, places like Colorado or Washington, D.C. Even more recently, there was an attack in Manchester, UK. And in those instances, what you're seeing are various repeats of this phrase that has showed up pretty frequently at protests, but has moved beyond just hate speech. Phrases like globalize the intifada, and have actually been used to justify actual violence, not just in Israel against Jews living in Israel, but also against Jews living in the West. It even extends as far as, I think, mixed reactions to the Trump plan. Whether or not you support the Trump plan, in part, depends on whether or not you think Hamas was justified on October 7. I think it's very meaningful, and I'm certainly not the first person to point this out, but it's odd that so many of the people who were chanting at various protests, ceasefire now, are not vocally supporting the Trump peace plan, even though it would effectively be a ceasefire or an end to the war in Gaza. And I think part of the reason why is because the Trump peace plan, unlike previous ceasefire proposals, insists on holding Hamas accountable for October 7 and forcing it to face the consequences of what it did on October 7. And again, this debate over whether or not you think that's right or wrong really comes down to, in many ways, whether or not you think Hamas was justified or not, and how you understand October 7 as an act of violence and terrorism or as an act of justified self-defense. It really is, I think, a sign of some social decay or moral corruption in our society that we can't get on the same page about who was right and who was wrong on October 7, Hamas or Israel. And I'll share a verse with you, Sebastian, I think that I was reflecting on when I was trying to think about how to explain this tension that I feel about this moral issue. And it's Isaiah 5, verse 20. Let's throw it up on the screen so we can read it together. It says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light, light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." And in many ways, I think this is why it matters how you remember October 7, because when you can't tell the difference between evil and good and evil, or darkness and light, then you'll wind up making some pretty terrible choices in terms of the hateful things that you'll say, or even the violent things that you'll do to people who are on the other side of this issue if you can't tell right from wrong.
Wow,
It's
yeah.
a bit of a rant, but I think that's why it matters so much how we remember a day like October 7.
I love that you quoted this Bible verse. Josiah, would you say that the Holocaust happened in a pre-modern world and October 7 happened in post-modern world?
Not exactly. I think the Holocaust Western society had already entered something of a bit of a postmodern era by the time the Holocaust came around. But there are differences, yes, in terms of the culture at the time, the prevailing political ideologies that we were wrestling with at the time, and where some of these forms of anti-Semitism came from. I think today you're beginning to see more from the left, perhaps, than you saw during the Holocaust, which was primarily driven by extreme right-wing ideology or Nazi ideology. Today, it's an increase of that coming from the left, but also a bit of a resurgence of it coming from the right. So there are some historical parallels, but yes, I think what you're getting at is that we do live in a different era with unique challenges.
Yeah, I think in the 1930s, there was already a lot of progressivism, a lot of moral confusion already. But I think in most part, people were still able to call evil evil and say, there's a wrong side, there's a good side, there's a bad side here. Today, there is a lot of confusion on that. So I think, Josiah, when I think about the importance to remember October 7th, is I think about October 7th was the worst slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. Of course, we cannot compare the two. The Holocaust was a continental extermination of millions of Jews. It was a genocide. October 7th was a genocidal attack. It was a bordering terrorist group that invaded Israel, killed a significant percentage of the population, kidnapped many more, injured many more. Of course, the two cannot compare, but what I would like to compare is the contrast, the difference of how the world reacted after the Holocaust and how the world has reacted now. Just really quick, just to say some things. After the Holocaust, the world really did just also because of the two great wars that were fought, the world kind of did the tent, and they wanted to take a look at ourselves. So after the Holocaust in 1948, because of the Holocaust, it led to the creation and adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was in 1948. There was also the Convention on Prevention and Punishment for Crime and Genocide in 1948. After this, we got terms like genocide. I don't think we had that term before. And I think I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, I was listening to a book about the Ottomans, and it was a young Jewish boy who was at a trial of the Turkish genocide of the Armenians, who learned from this. He grew up, his parents were killed in the Holocaust, he survived the Holocaust, and he's the one who came up with this term of the genocide. Do you know about this?
I'm not familiar
Okay.
with that individual's backstory, but yeah, the term genocide did originate out of the Holocaust. It was the first time that the term was used because the Holocaust was so severe that they just didn't have a word for a crime of that scale.
Yeah, and then the last thing, I think one of the things that we can point is, for instance, the Catholic Church. They had a second Vatican Council. They released this theological document called Nostra Aetate, where the Catholic Church even reflected on their own disposition towards the Jewish people. But after October 7th, we have not seen as much. We saw, like, the week after October 7th, a lot of countries, a lot of people around the world said some very nice things of sympathy towards Israel. But immediately, for instance, yesterday was the second anniversary in Melbourne, Australia. There were graffitis saying, "Glory to Hamas, October 7th, do it again." This is the country where we saw a crowd of people chanting in Sydney, "Gas the Jews," right after October 7th, "Gas the Jews." Also, it's a country where a nurse said that if a Jewish person came to her establishment, that she would not give them service, that she would try to kill them. We have seen anti-Semitism quadrupled in France. We have seen anti-Semitism go up like 400% in the United States. You mentioned the terror attack in England, and finally the United States. We can point, for instance, at the murder of these two Jewish staffers from the embassy in Washington, D.C., who were there to talk about how to get more aid into Gaza, or like talking about this issue, and they were murdered for being Jewish. So this is, I think, is a huge difference. It's really, I love that you pointed this Bible verse of, we are in a crisis of people calling the evil good and calling good evil. And I know this is, he's a politician, he's a dictator, he's got his own things going on, talking about the leader of Turkey today. But he's the one who keeps saying, like, apologizing for Hamas. He's like, Hamas is committed to peace. Israel is a genocidal state. Like, he, of course, again, he's a politician, he's a dictator, but the moral confusion coming from his statements, I think, is a reflection of a moral crisis around the world. So we wanted to start there. We just wanted to raise the issue of what it matters, how we remember October 7th. That's why we're here. And we're glad that you listeners and the audience watching this on YouTube, that you're here with us. So let's just remind ourselves of the facts, because I think it's important. Josiah, let's briefly describe the events of October 7th. What actually happened on that day?
So, high level, I think if we want to accurately describe what happened on October 7th, because this story is much too long to go through in detail or even to give a complete timeline. But what basically happened is that Hamas invaded Israel on its southern border with the Gaza Strip. It completely shattered a false sense of security that Israel had allowed itself to build up internally vis-a-vis its conflict with Hamas. And there's been much written about the mistakes that Israel made leading up to October 7 in allowing that false sense of security to permeate its security establishment. Hamas took advantage of that. They took advantage of that. They took advantage of an over-reliance on technology and an underestimation within Israeli society of its will to engage in violence towards Israel. Took advantage of that by destroying some of the technology on the border, which allowed it to then infiltrate the border, and then attacking IDF bases very quickly that are on the border of southern Israel and the Gaza Strip, so that they could take control, essentially, of those military installations and cripple the ability of the IDF and the security forces to respond, to communicate with members and units within the IDF, and to mobilize individuals to respond to what was happening in southern Israel. This allowed thousands of Hamas terrorists many hours to effectively run around southern Israel unchallenged, except by members of police forces or people who drove without even being called down to the south to fight the terrorists. There were many heroes who fought Hamas on that day, but there was a pretty big gap in terms of an organized response by the military because of the way that Hamas conducted the early hours of its attack. What's important, I think, to clarify is that while they did prioritize attacking those IDF bases and crippling Israel's security response, that wasn't really the primary objective. The primary objective was a massacre, because most of the people killed on that day, or even most of the people who were taken hostage, a majority, were civilians. They quickly pivoted from those IDF bases and began targeting different agricultural communities like kibbutzim, which basically is a farm community in southern Israel, a relatively small community. And there are many images of the horrible destruction that took place in some of those locations. They also happened upon a music festival at the Rain Forest called the Nova Music Festival. And there they killed almost 400 people and took many hostages. So there were really horrific things happening in areas that were not IDF bases. Hamas was targeting civilian areas, the civilian population, with the intent to massacre and commit atrocities against them, not just attempting to attack IDF bases. And that's why I think it's important to characterize the events of October 7 as an atrocity, not as a military offensive.
Yeah, one thing that I will highlight here is that these people had maps. I think the IDF has been able to produce that some of these terrorists came with maps and they knew exactly where to go. Because, as we understand, a lot of Gazans had the opportunity to go work in Israel and they work in these communities. So they knew these communities very well. And they were able to provide Hamas with those maps so Hamas could do the most damage that they could, which is, again, just such a perverse and evil thing. After October 7th, one of the bigger, issues was Israel and the Israeli spokesperson showing and showing videos and telling people what had happened, and many others believing that no, it didn't happen. They're making it up. Israel's making it up. So, what kind of atrocities can we actually prove happened, Josiah?
Yeah, it's challenging because there were a lot of stories coming out of the southern Israel, of the Gaza envelope area in the first few weeks after October 7. And to be fair, there was a general fog of war. There was some confusion about what had actually happened, what had rumored to have happened, but there wasn't necessarily proof for. And so there's been a bit of debate over what actually happened, what did not happen. At this point, 2 years later, however, there's been some pretty thorough investigation and review of photo, video evidence, as well as eyewitness testimony. And there are a few things that can be proven that actually did happen. We don't have to wonder whether they happened or not. One of the first things I think is very important to clarify, that there's just no denying this, is that the victims of October 7 were not just soldiers. In fact, the majority of them were not. I want to reiterate this fact that they were both men and women, many of them not in uniform, but being killed in their homes, some of them literally in their beds or in their pajamas in their safe rooms. You had young children, some of them very young. I think the youngest was still an infant. You had people who were elderly. Holocaust survivors were killed in their homes on October 7, which is just a tragic irony to try to wrap your head around. You had both Jews and Arabs killed. Okay, this was a very non-discriminatory attack. And what I mean by that is that they killed or hurt almost anyone that they came across. They didn't leave room for anyone or spare anyone that they came across during the attack on October 7. They engaged in various forms of torture and mutilation, and I'm not really going to get into the details, but I think it's worth noting that these things actually did happen. And again, there's enough evidence now that we don't have to wonder or deny this, that they did really horrible things to people. I think in order to send a message that the Jews were less than human, they were evil, they were weak, and it was a massive success from a psychological warfare standpoint, what Hamas did, not just torturing people or mutilating bodies, but then spreading those images as far and wide as they possibly could intentionally. Like they live streamed much of what they did on October 7. They burned some victims alive. They engaged in mass sexual violence. And this took a while for the international community to sort of catch up and acknowledge what had happened. But we finally got to a point where even the United Nations and relevant agencies were issuing their own reports confirming what everyone knew to be true in the first few days after October 7, that Hamas had not just slaughtered many people, but engaged in sexual violence against both men and women, in some cases even children, and even against hostages that they took into the Gaza Strip. So really, really terrible things happening. Then, of course, you have the kidnapping itself, the fact that they kidnapped 250 people, again, men, women, children, elderly, Jews, Arabs, people of up to 30 different nationalities or countries represented. This was not just a crime against Israel, but I think in every classic definition of the word, it was a crime against humanity. What Hamas did on October 7, taking people from 30 different countries captive into the Gaza Strip. It really was very horrific. And at this point, there is room to debate some of the reports that came out in the first week, of course, yes, because some of them were mistaken, but there's no denying that mass atrocities took place on October 7 because the investigations have been done, are still ongoing, and the proof is there. The photos and the videos, you can't unsee those things.
Yeah, Josiah, could we maybe include in the notes some resources where people can go and look at this stuff for themselves? Maybe we can recommend some documentaries or some place where they can go and see. For instance, one thing that we can recommend I found truly eye-opening. There is a tool that Israel created, some Israelis created, where you can see a map. You can see a map of the areas around the Gaza border, and you can literally zoom in with the location of where somebody's lives were taken, and you can click and see their names, age, their story, if it's available. And when you look at this map and just see the destruction, you just showed that picture a moment ago of just how destructive this was. So I think that would be a good thing to include. Let me share a story. Like Josiah and I are about to share two stories or a couple of stories that resonated with us that are representative of what happened on that day. And when I think about some of the worst things that happened, I think about the Bibas family. We all have seen the picture of these beautiful two redheaded babies, Ariel and Kafir Bibas. This is a representative story of tragedy. Let me start with their grandparents. So on that day, their mom is named Shiri, and that's Shiri. Those are the two babies, Ariel and Kafir. Her parents came from South America. Her mom came from Peru and her dad from Argentina. They've been in Israel for more than 40 years through Zionists who came down to settle the land in the south. They came to Israel, and she grew up and she got engaged to her husband Yarden in 2017. They got married a year after. She was 32, Ariel was 4, and Kafir was only 9 months when they were kidnapped for kibbutz Nir Oz. We didn't know if they were alive for a long time, but as we came to find out later, by the way, let's remember how they were released by Hamas. When they were released in coffins, and there were all these people behind these terrorists celebrating and chanting and saying, "Praise to Allah," because of these babies in coffins. And remember that when they went taken over to Israel, they were the wrong body. I think Shir's body, right?
It was Shiri's body was the wrong one. They had to demand that her actual body be sent.
So they had to send that body back, Shiri's real body back. The idea confirmed that these babies were actually running, if you want to skip this part. These babies were murdered with bare hands. Terrorists apparently murdered them cold hand, but with their bare hands. They were buried together on February 26, 2025. And today, Yarden has lost both his babies, his wife, and his in-laws. So the parents of Shiru were also murdered in one day. I think this highlights how tragic this was, and this is just one story of many. I think there were more than 1,000 orphans after October 7th, and more than 250 widows or widowers left by this destruction. So Josiah, that's the story that I think really got to my heart. What about you? What is one story that you think we should remember?
Yeah, I've got a couple that I'll try to share very briefly. These are difficult stories to tell, but
I remember
these
faces.
reason.
Yeah,
I think I'll say this, Sebastian. Any story involving young children is pretty difficult for me to process because I am a father of young children. So those speak to me on a pretty deep level. And not just those stories, but especially those stories, it just hits you in a place that you don't always expect. This is a family of 4 who were attacked on October 7 in one of those communities in southern Israel. Their parents, as you can see here, are Hadar and Itay Berdichesky, and they have 2 young twin sons who lived with them. And the 2 twins, or the 2 boys, managed to survive October 7, but only because their parents hid them and then left them to go fight the terrorists, knowing that they probably would be killed in the process, and they were. The boys survived for somewhere between 10 and 12 hours hiding by themselves. Infants, not I say hiding, they were just alone by themselves for 10 to 12 hours before they were eventually found by people searching the community for survivors. And by that point, obviously, their parents had already been killed and had been killed many hours before. So this, I think, is a really powerful story, both about the cruelty of Hamas in attacking families. This family posed no threat to Hamas or to Palestinians, none whatsoever. And it speaks especially to the cruelty of Hamas that they would attack this family anyways, but also I think it's important not to overlook the heroism of family members or parents that chose to sacrifice themselves in order to save their children. And this is just one of many stories of heroism demonstrated by different Israeli heroes on October 7 in order to save the lives of others or to give up their lives in the defense of others on that day. There is also another story, I think, that means a lot to me personally because I knew his family. I had Shabbat dinner with a family a few months before October 7, 2023, on one of my trips to Israel, the Goldberg-Polin family. And I did not have the opportunity to meet every member of the family. There was one missing because he was away doing something adventurous, which was his usual habit. That was Hersh. But I managed to have dinner with the rest of the family and learn a little bit about Hersh. And then several months later, Hersh was at the Nova Music Festival when it was attacked on October 7, 2023. He ran and hid with many others in one of those roadside shelters that you might see, the concrete structure that's supposed to shelter you from rockets when there's a siren. And they were attacked. Terrorists found this group and threw grenades inside, most of which were thrown back out of the shelter by one of Hersh's friends until his friend was killed, trying to throw a grenade back outside the shelter. And in the process of this attack by terrorists on this roadside shelter, Hersh lost his arm. As you can see in this photo, he was taken hostage into Gaza, given relatively poor medical treatment. But you can see in this video that Hamas published for their own propaganda that he's missing a good portion of his left arm. And he really became a symbol in many ways for the hostage crisis because his parents were very passionate and dedicated and devoted and tireless in their efforts to advocate for his release. Tragically, in August, I believe it was August of 2024, he was one of 6 hostages who was executed in point blank range or close range in one of the tunnels under the Gaza Strip by Hamas when it appeared that Israeli forces were getting too close and might rescue him and the other hostages. After the fact, I think one of the things that is so inspirational about this story, not just the fact that I had a small connection to his family, but the fact that it came out later as other hostages were released who had spent some time with Hersh during their captivity, that he was one of the more inspirational hostages in the eyes of the other captives in the Gaza Strip. What I mean by that is that they came out, many of them saying things like, he taught us how to have hope. He told us that as long as you have a why, you'll figure out the how, essentially. And I'm paraphrasing, but there was a famous quote that he was fond of sharing with the other hostages, reminding them that as long as they remembered what they were fighting for, why they needed to survive, they would always be able to figure out a way to survive. And many of the hostages credit him for the fact that they managed to survive hundreds of days in captivity and return to their loved ones. One of them happened to be the father of a young boy who had lost his mother on October 7. And if not for the fact that he managed to survive captivity, in part thanks to Hersh and his encouragement, his son would be another one of the orphans added to the list that you shared, Sebastian. So I think it's important to remember these stories. There's so much darkness and heaviness about the story of October 7, and yet if you dig deep enough, you can find some really inspirational stories about how people manage to think not just of themselves, but also others, which is honestly incredible. And I have a hard time imagining how you could summon the energy to be so selfless in the midst of that type of darkness, but people did, and I think it's something that we should hold on to, those stories about light in the darkness.
Yeah, and if Hersh got anything from his mom, you guys can hear her speaking on "Call Me Back" podcast by Dan Senior. He hosts Rachel, Hersh's mother, to talk about the Jewish holidays and the days of awe, things like that. She's very spiritual, very inspirational, and I can see why she was opening her home to Christians to come and have Shabbat dinner with them in Israel. That's awesome. And also, you just reminded me of like how people managed to survive. We also have passages hosted Yair Horn, whose brother Eitan Horn is still being held hostage. He told us at a conference that we held in the summer how they used to just make each other laugh, like just make each other laugh, joke, and be silly, because they're really silly. If you see pictures of Eitan Horn on YouTube, he was like a camp counselor, youth leader, and he was super funny. He is super funny. We believe he's still alive, and hopefully we'll see him liberated next week by God's grace. So yeah, they just kept each other alive through joking and messing with each other. So the human resilience is incredible. So Josiah, now the whole point of today is being able to remember accurately, to remember correctly. Remember is actually one of if it's probably the most repeated commandment in the Bible. Probably number 2. I don't know if hear or remember. Usually the context of remembering is God telling the people of Israel to remember him, to remember the Lord, to remember what God did for them, taking them out of Egypt. But remembering is important. So why don't we talk about how not to remember October 7th first of all? Because a lot of people are confused about this. So, how should we not remember October 7th?
I would say if we're going to compare and contrast how we should not remember October 7 and how we should remember October 7, there's three things that we need to avoid at all costs. One, we should not think of October 7 as an act of self defense. And Hamas and other Palestinian factions, many supporters of those Palestinian factions or of Hamas, many critics of Israel, have repeatedly made the argument over the last 2 years since October 7 that it was basically an act of national resistance. It was an act of self defense against the Israeli war machine. It was an act of Palestinian self determination. And I think that's a lot of hogwash. It's really a mistake, a very critical mistake to characterize what happened on October 7 as an act of self defense when you think about who the actual victims of October 7 were. Yes, Hamas did attack some IDF bases, but also they conducted these extreme massacres against civilians. And if you think about who these people were, either the attendees at the Nova Music Festival, both the tourists and the Israeli citizens, if you think about who lived on the border of these communities near the Gaza Strip, these were, by and large, for the most part, the peaceniks or the peace activists, people who didn't hate Palestinians. They loved Palestinians. They didn't hate the idea of a two-state solution. They actively advocated for or worked towards a two-state solution. They found ways to serve Palestinians living in Gaza, whether it was offering them jobs working in their communities, as you previously referenced, or whether it was trying to send aid into Gaza, or it was offering rides to citizens of Gaza who needed transportation from the border to a hospital in Israel for some medical care. That's the kind of life that these people led. So the people that Hamas chose to attack didn't pose a threat to Hamas or to Palestinians. They demonstrated love towards the Palestinians in most cases. And that's why I think it's just such a terrible mistake to say that what happened on October 7 was an act of self-defense. It wasn't. It was a massacre of people that in most cases were trying to help you. It also was, I think, not an aberration. And we need to avoid thinking of this as sort of like a random incident that's not typical of Hamas's behavior or how it thinks. It's very typical. If it's a pattern, as early as the late 2000s, when Hamas is just taking control of the Gaza Strip, they're already exercising some of these tactics or experimenting with different strategies like tunnels or kidnapping or rocket capabilities. And it's pretty clear if you follow the history of these various cycles of violence between Hamas and Israel, that Hamas was over time learning and testing, building capabilities for an operation like this. And it fits within a general pattern. The last thing I would say, as far as what October 7 was not, is it was not a limited operation. Okay. This isn't one of those quick raid across the border, grab a hostage, run back to Gaza. That's not what this was supposed to be. If you read or explore some of the documents that have been discovered in Gaza post October 7, some of the investigations that have been done, the research that's come out about what Hamas actually intended to happen, they were in some ways surprised at how much success they had in terms of their own exploits in southern Israel. But the intention was not that this was just a Hamas operation, but rather this would be a massive operation that Hezbollah would join from the north as well. And that the goal was not just a quick raid into Israel and then back. It was, no, we intend to enter Israel, to claim Israeli territory, to not give it back. And if everything goes perfectly according to plan, possibly to destroy Israel entirely. It's not. It's a mistake to think about this as an act of self-defense or a break from a pattern or some limited operation that had very limited goals. It wasn't. It was a blatant attempt at annihilation and total defeat of Israel. To characterize it as anything other than that is to just ignore all of the evidence that's come out since.
Yeah, Josiah, I agree with all that. I want to go back to this whole thing of what could have happened and by God's grace was not able to happen during my prayer points. But that's how we should not remember October 7th. How should we remember October 7th then? Because when we speak about how not to remember, one of the things I remember was a Columbia professor, I think, or maybe it was a Cornell professor who came out in like one of these anti-Israel rally, pro-Hamas rallies after October 7th. And he was like, it was accelerating. It was accelerating that mural confusion because in his mindset, in the best case scenario, he sees this as freedom fighters, mujahideen who are liberating the people. But this is not, like you just said, that's how we should not remember. This was a genocidal attack to innocent babies. So how should we remember October 7th then?
Well, I think you used an appropriate word just now, an active genocide. If you understand the intent of what they actually wanted to do, it was to cleanse the land of the filth that is the Jewish people in their minds. It's seen not just in their words, but also their actions. There's no other reason why you would go around kidnapping and or shooting Jewish children. They're not of fighting age. They pose no threat to you. They've done nothing wrong. They're guilty of nothing except for the fact that they exist in the land and you don't think that they should. So the fact that they're going around killing these people or attacking these people, I think is proof of their intent, spoken intent to annihilate the Jewish people and the state of Israel. It's also, I think, important to think about this as an act of terrorism. Again, it's not an act of resistance, it is an act of terrorism because they're not just attacking the Israeli military, they're attacking civilians who pose no threat and have no connection to the IDF other than the fact that they're under their protection. And that, I think, is very key because what that means is that it's an act of violence against civilians, which is, again, part of this classic definition of what is terrorism versus legitimate military conflict. The last thing I think is important to note is it's the start of a regional war. It was not successful in the sense that it didn't drag everyone in on the day of October 7th, the way that Hamas predicted would happen or hoped it would happen. But if you look over the last 2 years, they did succeed in basically creating or sparking this coalition of terror organizations around the Middle East attacking Israel, whether that be Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen, other related groups in Syria and Iraq under the sponsorship of the Islamic Republic, Iran, or even the Islamic Republic of Iran itself, attacking Israel multiple times. So it's important to recognize this, that October 7 was not just a one-off event where Hamas attacks Israel. It was a deliberate attempt to, and successful attempt to, inspire a coalition of terror organizations around the Middle East to join them in this war against Israel.
That is so true. Yeah. Let me jump into my prayer points and just I'd like for you to end then to finish up our episode today with your prayer points. Because when I think about prayer points for today, first of all, I think we should praise God. We should praise God that He restrained the hand of evil on that day. As horrific as this was, this fatal attack, it could have been much worse. And one of the big differences is between the Holocaust and this attempt at a genocide is that the Israelis have a IDF today. They have an Israeli Defense Forces. They have a country, they have a territory, they have an army that can defend themselves. And although that day was a horrific failure of intelligence, and if you guys are more interested in learning about this, I just finished listening to a book by the former head of the Mossad, Yossi Cohen, where he talks about in a whole chapter about more details on why this could have been prevented with better intelligence. He has a political agenda, just so you know. But anyways, this was a horrific failure of intelligence. People were caught off guard. It was a holiday. A lot of people were home. But when the Israelis were able to get back to the battle lines and Israeli civilians volunteered, they just jumped in their cars and went down there and tried and heroes saved many civilian lives. It could have been much worse. It could have kept going. Their plan was to like go to Beersheba and establish outposts and retain land and defend themselves. And hopefully they were trying to get Hezbollah in Lebanon to get going and for the Houthis, and just this would be the war that would end Israel, because they see Israel as a foreign colonizer that they need to get rid of, like the Algerians are the French. The difference is that the French had a France to return to. Jews had nowhere to go. This is their homeland. They're not colonizers going back somewhere else. So praise God that He restrained the hand of evil. And second, I think we need to pray that Hamas will cease to be a threat, not only to Israelis, but also to civilians in Gaza themselves. Let's acknowledge on this anniversary that a lot of civilians have died in Gaza as well. And the responsibility of that is on Hamas, because Hamas could have ended this war on October 10th if they had just given up the hostages, all of them, but they don't. And they're still refusing to do that right now. So hopefully by the end of this week, we'll see a deal happen. And friends, we'll be here next week to talk about that if it happens. We're praying that it will happen, because if it will, it would not only save Israeli lives, it will save Palestinian lives, people in Gaza as well. I think we should also pray for families to heal. I want to get into a little weird thing, but as we know, most Israelis are secular people, and I've heard about some of the treatment that they're using to help people cope with the PTSD, and it breaks my heart because some of these things I'm not sure if it will help. So I think we need to pray that people will be truly healed in their hearts from this pain, that they will be comforted, that Israelis will be able to get back and continue to live a peaceful life. So let's pray for mercy, for healing, and that Hamas will cease to be a threat to global stability, because this war has really created global disorder around the world. So, Josiah, would you please finish up our episode and give us your prayer points?
I think I would echo what you said, Sebastian. If I were to add my own words to those prayers, I think I pray for peace, of course, but also justice. I think there's a deep sense or yearning in my own heart, but I know in yours as well, many friends of Israel and in Israel, also many of our Palestinian friends who suffer under the control of Hamas for a just peace, not just a peace, but a peace that holds accountable the perpetrators of evil and harm and suffering. I pray for an outcome to this war that reflects God's character and commitment to both, to peace, but also justice, his sense of or his standard of righteousness, and that vengeance would be his, essentially, as the Bible says. I also pray that we can see through a lot of the fog, that we can be people who can see the difference between good and evil, right and wrong, light and darkness, and not just people who can see the difference, but people who can communicate the difference and help others see the difference between those as well. I think we need a lot of that right now, but also that requires a lot of supernatural wisdom. And that's something that I pray for as well.
Thank you, Josiah, for helping us remember and for helping us set the record straight on what happened on this day. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for everything you have done as Passages alumni, friends of Passages throughout the last 2 years. I know many of you have been out to rallies, to vigils. You have been with us around the country. And even this week, our campus fellows are involved in many different events commemorating and highlighting the plight of the hostages right now and what happened to the victims on October 7th. Students, if you have any stories, share them in the comments. We'd love to hear them. We'd love to see them. And like I said earlier, if there is a deal, we'll be here next week anyways. But just know that if there is a deal, we'll hope to be soon after that with an episode talking about hopefully seeing hostages returning home, all of them. So let's pray for that. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time in the Passages Pulse. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.